So now we're on to chapter 5, which is anxiety in sports and exercise. The chapter objectives are to define and differentiate among anxiety-related concepts such as arousal, trait anxiety, social physique anxiety, competitive anxiety, and somatic anxiety. To list and describe the dimensions of an anxiety response, such as intensity, frequency of cognitive intrusions, and directional interpretation of anxiety. And to list and describe personal situation resources of anxiety in sports and exercise psychology. To describe how anxiety affects exercise behavior. To identify and describe key theories that explain the performance-anxiety relationship in sports and the cognitive and physiological mechanisms by which anxiety affects performance. And lastly, to define choking and identify the key explanations of this phenomenon. So, the basic concepts of anxiety. Anxiety is not arousal. Okay? Arousal, however, is a blend of physiological and psychological activation of an individual's autonomic nervous system. And what it does is it ranges from deep sleep to peak activation. It is neither pleasant nor unpleasant, and it occurs from positive and negative events. As we said, anxiety is an emotion and is multidimensional. Negative emotions with the following characteristics. Okay, it is elicited following an appraisal, so we have to decide and evaluate how potentially anxiety provoking the situation might be. It's universal across all of the cultures, so we look at emotions and how they are exhibited across cultures. It is exhibited the exact same way and follows the exact same process. It has a distinct physiology. It follows a distinct pattern in human behavior. It is observed through discrete facial expressions, as we know that there is a face for anxiety, just like there is a facial characteristics for anger and for happiness. And it is associated with a unique set of action tendencies. What we have to do is we have to differentiate between cognitive anxiety and somatic anxiety. And that's what we said when we talk about how it's a multi-dimensional framework and it has these two components. Okay, the mental component is called cognitive anxiety. It's concerns or worries that reduces the ability to focus or concentrate. Whereas somatic anxiety is the actual physiological and affective elements that develop directly from autonomic arousal. I want you to think of clammy hands, racing heart, and a raise in body temperature. Okay, so somatic anxiety is only experienced to the degree that the athlete becomes aware of arousal symptoms. So if you look at the opening vignette, both Ethan and Jason described experiencing cognitive anxiety, the worry and the pressure, and then the somatic anxiety, the pounding heart, the butterflies in the stomach, and the tense muscles. And although cognitive and somatic anxiety are conceptualized to be independent and distinctive, cognitive and somatic anxiety responses are moderately interrelated, and the levels of both anxiety responses are experienced in most competitive events. So we look at the anxiety is context specific. Okay, so we look at social anxiety. It's a specific type of anxiety that occurs during social situations. And we've all been in situations where we go in and meet new people. And there's a certain amount of physiological arousal that comes before we go into a situation. So we think about speaking in front of groups. And it occurs when evaluations may happen. Okay? Then we think of the sports and exercise world. Athletes are constantly being evaluated. Think of figure skaters. Think of gymnasts. They're constantly being evaluated by the judges. Okay, so we look at competitive trait anxiety. Okay, some research suggests that competitive anxiety is a form of social anxiety. Okay, in this form of anxiety, athletes may be concerned about their body, their performance, their fitness level, or their skills being evaluated by spectators, teammates, coaches, family, and friends. And competitive trait anxiety, when we look at it, it's a form of social anxiety, and they're concerned about their body performance and their skills. So social physique anxiety is most commonly studied in the sports and exercise world, and it's experiencing anxiety due to others' evaluations of physique in social settings, and it often occurs in the exercise context. Okay. State anxiety is associated with worries and apprehensions. Okay. For example, an exerciser may experience mild symptoms of anxiety when entering the locker room, with symptoms increasing in intensity in the moments waiting in the exercise studio for her instructor to begin the aerobics class. During the warm-up, the anxiety symptoms may subside, and you start to feel a little more comfortable in that setting, and be distracted by the aerobic routine, and that anxiety can then be reduced. Now, in contrast, trait anxiety is a relatively stable part of an individual's personality. It's a predisposition that the individual may have to perceive a variety of situations as physically or psychologically threatening. So, anxiety involves a transaction between the person and the environment. Okay, um, you know, anxiety and stress are considered to be an ongoing process rather than single events. So, they're influenced by the demands placed on the athlete and the exercise by the environment. How good is the competition? How many other exercises are in your class? And of course, then the evaluation by the athlete or exerciser of the available resources. Previous experience, level of fitness, how often they exercise, and how much experience they have in that specific environment. There are dimensions, of the anxiety response. And, what does it mean to state that one exercise or sports participant has more anxiety than another? More could be referring to the intensity of anxiety symptoms and the number or the frequency of anxiety-related, thoughts or physical symptoms, as well as the directional interpretation of anxiety symptoms for sports performance and exercise behavior. So, most of the sport and exercise research investigating anxiety has exclusively examined the intensity of symptoms. How much an athlete's going to feel an anxiety response. This dimension of anxiety involves the amount of level of symptoms experienced by physical activity and sports participants. Okay, when we look at the frequency of cognitive intrusions, the frequency of the cognitive intrusions or symptoms refers to the amount of time, expressed as a percentage, that thoughts and feelings about the competition occupy an individual's mind. Okay, and directional interpretation of symptoms. Most sports and exercise psychology research agrees that negative emotions do not always negatively affect performance. Sometimes anxiety is perceived to have a positive influence on sports and exercise behaviors. Think about how two elite Canadian athletes describe the implications of their anxiety symptoms for future athletic performances. Blythe Hartley, the Olympic diver, he stated that the feelings of being a nervous wreck are positively interpreted by him as being a state of readiness for competition. And then alternatively, Steve Podbarski, he's an Olympic ski racer. He referred to a specific intensity of nervousness that, if reached, resulted in poor performance. So, typically you want to reach an optimal level of arousal so that your anxiety is slightly increased, but not to the point where it's starting to affect you negatively. And, that's the sweet spot in athletes. That's what they call it. And that allows you to go forward and perform with your body ready to react. So, there are 5 personal sources of anxiety: experience and skill level, gender, trait anxiety, self-confidence, and self-presentational beliefs. And lastly, self-regulation strategies. When it comes to experience and skill level, it's the relationship between skill level, experience, and competitive anxiety. It's been equivocal. In general, it appears that athletes of different skills or abilities do not differ in the intensity of anxiety symptoms prior to competition. When it comes to gender, the sports research on gender differences in anxiety has been inconsistent. Early research provided some evidence that female athletes report higher intensities of trait and state anxiety symptoms prior to competition, as opposed to their male counterparts. Some research, however, had failed to find differences between male and female competitive anxiety responses. In exercise and other physical activity settings, females consistently experience higher levels of social physique anxiety compared to other males. And that might be just the way we are socially teaching females via media to focus a little more on their physique and therefore have anxiety when they don't reach that goal. With trait anxiety, a number of personality traits or dispositions are known to influence an individual's level of competitive state anxiety and social physique anxiety. And these characteristics include competitiveness, extroversion, hardiness, neuroticism, optimism and pessimism, perfectionism, social consciousness, and self-esteem. And you can see how those are all related and how they would create a higher level of trait anxiety if you have those. Now, competitive trait anxiety, or the tendency to experience anxiety during competitive situations, as well as social physique anxiety, are going to be obviously increased if you have some of those traits. Now, self-confidence and self-presentational beliefs. Individuals' personal beliefs about being capable of achieving sports success, as well as being able to present his or her body and skills in a favorable manner, are critical sources of anxiety for sports and exercise participants. Research with sports competitors reveals that confidence in oneself and one's team is associated with less pre-competitive anxiety. You can see how someone would feel more comfortable in a team environment, and how a team can, reduce someone's levels of anxiety, or at least their appraisal of that anxiety, allowing them to, appraise it at a level that is more able to be managed by the individual athlete. Another set of beliefs that are related to anxiety are self-presentational concerns. And self-presentation, it's the process by which people attempt to monitor and control the impressions that other people hold of them. Athletes who are concerned about what others, such as competitors, teammates, coaches, and family, think of their skill level or fitness or ability to handle pressure, are more likely to experience elevations in competitive trait and state anxiety. Okay, the self-presentational beliefs they're a source of anxiety for many exercisers. For example, women who become more dissatisfied with their bodies, they experience more social physique anxiety. So how you appraise that is going to obviously affect your self-confidence and self-presentational beliefs. And lastly, self-regulation strategies. How a physical activity participant manages anxiety symptoms has been identified as another important source of anxiety. In sport, a variety of coping skills such as relaxation, self-talk, and cognitive restructuring and imagery can be used to adjust physiological arousal and the degree of worry or concern that is experienced. Okay? So, a series of recent studies, identified the ways in which male and female adolescents manage social physique anxiety, and that revealed that adolescents coped by engaging in exercise behavior. In fact, physical activity as a coping strategy was reported by approximately 12% of adolescents in that study. And this result, really shouldn't be that surprising, considering exercise is recommended by physicians as an important strategy for managing anxiety. And actually, when an individual is depressed, we typically do activity scheduling, and that invariably involves some form of physical activity. Another self-regulating strategy that has been received some attention by the researchers is the use of self-handicapping. And self-handicapping is defined as any action or choice of performance setting that enhances the opportunity to externalize or excuse failing and internalizing reasonably accepting credit for success. Athletes who use self-handicapping strategies are likely to diminish efforts during competition, select unattainable goals to achieve, exaggerate the pain associated with an injury, or complain illegitimately about the fairness of the referee in order to confuse whether performance failure is due to athlete's ability or due to external problems that the athlete had to manage. These athletes also have higher intensity levels of trait and state anxiety, and interestingly, the anxiety symptoms are more likely to be viewed as a facilitative for performance. So, there are 5 personal, sources of anxiety. And the first, is, experience, and skill level. The sports and exercise research also reveals that individuals' anxiety responses are not always related to personal sources. The environment, uniquely contributes to anxiety and physical activity participants' anxiety levels. Okay. So, the results of this research has been equivocal, and studies reveal different differences between novices and experts, and no difference between novices and experts when it comes to this. And it depends on the interpretation based on experience. And like I said, the research is inconsistent, and it's failed to find differences between female and male competitive responses. And females experience higher social physique anxiety and exercise roles. And different factors related to SPA for females and males. For trait anxiety, traits influence levels of CSA and SPA, and individuals' trait anxiety levels affect threat perception. In self-confidence and self-presentation of beliefs, as we talked about, beliefs about capability and presenting body favorably are sources of anxiety, and confidence lowers when levels of pre-competitive anxiety. In self-confidence and self-presentation of beliefs. Self-presentation, and self-presentational efficacy, the process by which individuals attempt to monitor and control other people's impressions of them, and self-presentational efficacy is the confidence of one's ability to present images of being an exerciser. And as we talked about the self-regulation strategies, coping skills are the behaviors to adjust physiological arousal and degree of worry or concern. Imagery and self-talk are obviously involved in that. And lastly, self-handicapping behaviors, actions or choices that externalize failure or internalize success. So, when we look at environment-based sources of anxiety, it's the temporal patterning in the sports environment. Athletes' anxiety changes before and during an event, and the somatic anxiety an individual feels is low before competition and rises sharply at performance onset. During and after competition, somatic anxiety will decrease, and cognitive anxiety, it has a different pattern. No changes in cognitive anxiety occur prior to competition, and during competition, it steadily declines in cognitive anxiety. The physical environment factors, may be sources of anxiety, and the research has shown that. The presence of mirrors may increase state and social anxiety for those high in trait social physique anxiety and versus, non-exercises. The type of clothing associated with social anxiety, can change based on, how people dress for specific things. You can see a gymnast might be a greater influence by social physique anxiety just solely based on what they have to wear. More revealing clothing is associated with social anxiety during exercise, and a lot of females have commented just based on going to the gym what that looks like, and how people dress for the gym affects their appraisal of their own anxiety. And it's a more important factor for inactive women. Okay, they tend to, as you become more physically active and more physically fit, the social physique anxiety tends to decrease as a woman becomes more satisfied with their body. And other people in the exercise environment is obviously going to affect and be a source of anxiety. Exercising in others' presence can increase anxiety in women. And that's why, there were some gyms that started creating female-only gyms. It made them feel more at ease, more relaxed, and less judged. And specific characteristics of exercisers are highly, interactive, they're positive and enthusiastic, and exercise leaders' clothing may also lead to greater anxiety. So, when we look at anxiety influences on exercise behavior and sports performance, high SPA individuals may exercise to improve bodies and receive positive evaluations, and avoid exercise to avoid situations of being evaluated. And SBS led to lower levels of physical activity in women with low levels of self-presentation. And lastly, only self-presentational efficacy predicted college men and women's exercise behavior, which is really interesting. So, we need to look at anxiety sports performance relationship models. And drive theory and inverted U hypothesis are huge when it comes to that. So these are two of the, since 1990, sports research has largely ignored the explanations, about the influence of competitive anxiety on sports performance, okay? And they ignored the explanations in favor of more complex theories that examine anxiety as from a multidimensional perspective. But two theories have recently gained support in the sports psychology research: zones of optimal functioning and catastrophe theory. But we need to take a look at drive theory and inverted hypothesis. Okay. So drive theory, it's two of the earliest theories used to understand the arousal-performance relationship, or Hull's drive theory and the inverted U hypothesis. And drive theory suggests that performance is a function of two factors: habit strength and arousal, or drive. And the more well-learned a task, the higher the habit strength, and the greater the arousal or higher drive, the better the performance. Thus, according to this theory, higher levels of arousal led to better performance. Unfortunately, as tasks such as competitive sports become more complex, this theory has generally not been supported. Basically, it's saying there's a positive relationship between performance and physiological arousal. So as performance went up, physiological arousal went up, and as physiological arousal went up, performance went up. And you can see that based here. The inverted U hypothesis is the exact opposite. That it says that performance and physiological arousal will go up to a certain point, which is considered, the optimal physical arousal, and that allows for the greatest peak performance. And once you reach that optimal level, any more physical arousal or stress or anxiety will actually start negatively affect performance. So as you can see here in the chart, as physiological arousal goes up, performance goes up to a certain point, and then as physiological arousal is created more, performance will then start to be affected negatively. So then we look at two theories that examine anxiety from the multi-dimensional approach. Zones of optimal functioning. And it states that optimal state anxiety zone varies among athletes. That state anxiety is individual and athlete dependent. And zone athletes have a better performance than those outside zone. Okay. So the theory is important for understanding how relationships between anxiety and performance differs between athletes. And it's not always the case that anxiety is detrimental to sports performance. Okay, and there is a chart, figure 5.4 here. It takes a look at individual zones of optimal functioning model, and it depicts the bandwidth of optimal performance for athletes with three different zones. There's athlete A, there's athlete B, and athlete C. An athlete A has high IZOF, athlete B has moderate, and then athlete C has low. Okay, so athlete A, it's out of the zone up to a certain point, and then it has best performance in that zone. And what it's looking at is that there are different types of individuals and how state anxiety will affect it. The athlete B is better to have a kind of more moderate level of state anxiety. Anything more than that will be out of the zone. Anything lower than that will be out of the zone as well. And then lastly, there are those athletes C where low state anxiety levels will create the best performance. Anything higher to a certain degree will create poor performance. And lastly, the theory of catastrophe theory. It attempts to describe the combined or interactive influences of multiple components of competitive anxiety and physiological arousal on athlete performance, rather than looking at them separately. So trying to integrate a more integrative model. And catastrophe theory is a three-dimensional model, and that includes the interaction of physiological arousal, rather than somatic anxiety, cognitive anxiety, and performance. Few sports psychology researchers have applied this model to understand the relationship between anxiety and sports performance, and it has been criticized for being overly complex. And how that kind of takes a look at is that when cognitive state anxiety is low, the relationship between physiological arousal and the performance is an inverted U shape. And then when physiological arousal is high, elevations in cognitive and state anxiety are associated with enhanced performance relative to the baseline. And then when physiological arousal is high, elevations in cognitive state anxiety are associated with performance declines. And then, when cognitive state anxiety is high, the effect of evaluations in physiological arousal can be positive or negative for performance. And then when physiological arousal is moderately high and cognitive state anxiety is high, it predicts a dramatic performance drop, a catastrophe that will occur. Okay, and the catastrophe doesn't usually occur with low cognitive state anxiety. Typically, it happens with higher levels. And here we have, the Kusk catastrophe theory and the model itself, and you can see, how performance Z, it's increased We're in cognitive design, it looks at more of a 3D model, okay? And you can see how performance surface, it can drop quite dramatically. And that's where the catastrophe definitely happens. So underlying mechanisms of anxiety-performance relationship. So, there are two primary mechanisms: the cognitive processing of relevant environmental information, and then appropriate levels and coordinated muscle activation. So when we look at, the cognitive mechanisms, they're affected by elevated competitive anxiety. Their competitive anxiety can affect the amounts and types of information processed, task relevant versus task irrelevant. And it affects the type of cognitive processing, conscious control versus automatic. Attentional mechanisms, it's the first attentional focus problem. Results of studies have demonstrated that competitive anxiety affects the amount and the type of information that is attended to. So task relevant versus, task irrelevant. And the type of cognitive processing, conscious control versus automatic, that occurs during competitive sports performance. The first attentional focus problem is associated with elevations in competitive anxiety, and it's called attentional focus and selective hypothesis, which states that an elevation in competitive state anxiety reduces the ability to attend to and process large amounts of information. It's likened to traveling down a tunnel. An increase in competitive state anxiety is associated with a narrowing of attentional focus, meaning the athlete is not paying attention to all the cues in the environment. Okay, that narrowing of attention stops the appraisal of the environment and is more kind of focused, almost like what we call tunnel vision, right? And so the performance improves if unimportant distraction cues are blocked. Okay, and performance may be diminished if important task-relevant cues are missed. The second attentional focus problem is that high anxious athletes attend to task irrelevant information more than low anxious athletes. So the more anxious you are, the more you're going to focus on things that are unrelated to the task at hand. In high anxious athletes, attention is governed by subjective importance of cues, the threat, rather than location in the visual field. Okay. And the third attentional focus problem is, competitive anxiety causes shifts to conscious processing. It's likened to paralysis by analysis. The more you're analyzing your environment, the more it's going to shift your conscious awareness, and the more it's going to paralyze your ability to perform. So, physiological mechanisms. It's the relationship between competitive anxiety and athlete performance can be explained through anxiety-related changes to the functional patterns of muscle activation. But traditionally, it's been proposed that increased physiological arousal disrupts the performance of motor skills that require manual dexterity and fine motor control. Elevated physiological arousal can increase anaerobic power, which in turn may enhance the performance of simple tasks such as jumping. Arousal is likely to impact an athlete's physical functioning in a number of ways, and we'll take a look at that. Increased muscle tension, which can impact motor control. Higher levels of arousal can then decrease performance of fine motor skills, then obviously affecting your performance. High arousal has also been associated with difficulties in coordination of movements among soldiers requiring to do stepping tasks and weightlifters performing a snatch lift. Lastly, looking at choking. It's the acute, significant decrements in performance that occurs in situations of high pressure or anxiety. Then the factors affecting or the influence choking shown in the research are consciously controlling movements, even for well-learned tasks or reinvesting. Complex tasks are more likely to lead to choking than simpler ones. Environmental factors, such as the presence of evaluators, can lead to increase in choking. Novices choke due to attentional problems or just a lack of experience in that environment. And, experts tend to choke due to self-focus, focusing too much on self and less on allowing their training to take over. So we look at the myths. Anxiety symptoms are generally the same for all sports and exercise participants, and we've taken a look at that, how that's not true. Personality comes into play, how experienced the athlete is in an individual in a specific environment. Exercise always helps to reduce anxiety. We know that, yes, it definitely can help to a certain point, and it also depends on personality as well. And lastly, pre-competitive anxiety always negatively affects sports performance. And we learned that from the U curve that we looked at previously, that you can have a certain amount of anxiety that will affect performance positively to a certain point. And then once you reach that point, that optimal level of performance, more anxiety added to the equation creates lower performance. Now we'd like to take a look at Chapter 6, which is aggression and moral behavior in sport. And, a lot of attention has been placed in the sports and exercise world on aggression and how that produces certain moral behaviors. What's moral behavior is acceptable and not acceptable. We see a lot with that in hockey when it comes to fighting. There was a ban on lower end hockey players on doing certain actions on the ice. They reduced fighting for novice hockey players in order to allow them to develop more normally and to stop concussion syndrome. So it is definitely an area of research that's fairly huge when it comes to sports and exercise psychology. The chapter objectives are explain how moral behavior develops and what impacts it has on sport. To discuss the factors that influence the development of moral behaviors. To define aggression and differentiate from other terms such as assertion and violence. To discuss the key theories useful for understanding why people behave aggressively. To outline how some of the personal situation and group factors influence aggressive behaviors. To understand the consequences of aggression behavior on athletes and spectators, and discuss ways to reduce aggression behavior in sport. So, there are two character development perspectives. First is structural developmental perspective. It starts with moral development, the process in which an individual develops the capacity to reason morally. Okay. In the structural developmental perspective, Lawrence Kohlberg suggested that in contrast to Piaget's theory of cognitive development, moral reasoning develops and progresses well into adulthood. And typically, your prefrontal cortex, that is directly responsible to inhibiting or exhibiting certain behaviors, and of course where your personality is and your ability to stop yourself from doing certain, and where your moral compass typically is located, that develops up until typically 25 or 26. So before that, you have a lower ability to make conscious decisions that are more rational. And so based on his testing through interviews using hypothetical moral dilemma scenarios, Kohlberg arrived at 6 developmental stages of moral judgments, and he grouped them into 3 levels. The first level was pre-conventional morality, in which the children abides by rules in fear and punishment, that's stage 1, or in hopes of receiving rewards, stage 2. The second level is conventional morality, whereby individuals will conform to avoid disapproval of others, and will uphold laws and social rules. That's stage 4. And the final level, pre-conventional morality, is established as an individual's moral reasoning is no longer confined by the strict boundaries of rules. That is, actions are guided by principles commonly agreed on as being essential, stage 5. And, these actions are self-selected and guided by ethical principles, stage 6. And according to Kohlberg, the majority of people, including athletes, will never progress beyond the second level. And less than 10% of individuals display stage 6 moral reasoning. So then the question becomes, can sport be used to develop character? And Canadian researchers Martin Carmier and Pierre Trudel interviewed 20 high school athletes and asked them about character development. Many of these athletes reported not learning much about moral development through sport. And this research tells us that moral development doesn't happen simply because a sports participant is in sport. Instead, character development can occur in sport when it is targeted. For instance, programs such as the First Tee Golf Life Skills Program and the Sports United to promote sports education and recreation life skills program, they've all shown that young athletes feel better about solving problems and physically perform better, and that these life skills transfer outside of sport. So it is a specific program that's going to specifically target certain things. So here again, it's the structural developmental perspective, the pre-conventional morality, fear of punishment, hope of rewards, Conventional morality, conform for approval. 3, post-conventional morality, the principal actions. Okay, so the second perspective is social learning perspective. And the social learning perspective, maintains that moral behavior or the carrying out of an action that is deemed to be right or wrong, it's learned through the process of reinforcement and modeling. Looking at other people's behavior, understanding how they go about doing it, and then obviously modeling that behavior that we appraise as the right behavior to engage in. This perspective, does suggest that participation in sport teaches and/or reinforces, sports personship behaviors. And in fact, some people argue that athletes tend to be more unsportsmanlike than their non-athlete counterparts, and that sports involving physical contact, hockey or football, negatively impacts an athlete's moral reasoning. And that was Bloom and Smith in 1996. On the other hand, Beller and Stoll found that non-athletes in high school had higher moral reasoning scores than did athletes in high school. And on the other hand, Stanger and colleagues in 2012 conducted an experiment with undergraduate sports science students to examine the effects of empathy on aggression. Participants were randomly assigned to either a high empathy group or a low empathy group. And the high empathy group, they were asked to take the perspective of another individual. And the low empathy group, they were asked to be objective and detached from the other person's feelings. And the results show that high empathy group experience stronger negative emotional reactions to aggressive actions than the low empathy group. And these findings suggest that empathy can be used to reduce aggressive behavior. Some of the factors, influenced by moral behavior, obviously the sports environment, directly influenced by the coach. Sports can be where moral behaviors flourish by the promotion and cooperation, team loyalty, fair play, respect for, your opponents, and, the perseverance when faced with adversity. Shields and colleagues in 2007 surveyed 700 athletes ranging from 9 to 15 from a variety of team sports, basketball, hockey, soccer, etc. The perceptions of the coach were related to whether an athlete would behave in an appropriate manner. So obviously that modeling coming in here, how an individual appraises their coach to react in a certain way is going to directly impact their behavior. The motivational climate, mastery versus performance, motivational climate can be categorized into 2 types, mastery motivational climate and performance motivational climate. Mastery motivational climate is when the coach encourages cooperation and learning from past mistakes, whereas performance motivational climate is when the coach emphasizes winning and stresses competition among teammates. So in 2006, a study examined the motivational climate of adolescent male soccer players in relation to their pro-social and antisocial behaviors. Pro-social behavior is intended to assist or benefit another individual or team. Whereas antisocial behavior is intended to harm or disadvantage another individual or team. And this could include pretending to be injured, trying to injure, or hitting an opponent. And the results showed that antisocial behaviors were carried out at a higher frequency and with a wider range of expression than pro-social behaviors. Okay, and in addition, pro-social behaviors decreased as the players got older. And lastly, as athletes got older, their motivational climate, direct relationship to the competition goals of sport, and related to the incidence of uncontrolled aggression outside of the rules of sport. Okay, now using Sylvia's definition, the term aggressive is not appropriate for the description of the baseball and the volleyball players' behaviors that were provided in the textbook. Sports psychologists prefer to describe those behaviors as assertive. And the difference between an aggressive and assertive action is that the latter does not include the intent to harm another living being. Assertive behavior includes those actions that are forceful, vigorous, and legitimate, but the individual performing these behaviors does not intend to injure an opponent, like a hard tackle in football. And therefore, when a coach or parent tells an athlete or child to play more aggressively, in most situations, what they are encouraging is that the behavior is more assertive. Okay? So, aggressive behavior involves, 4 key points. Okay? It is a behavior, an act, not an emotion or feeling or personality trait. It can be verbal or physical. It is intended to cause physical or psychological harm, and it is directed towards another living organism. And we need to differentiate between instrumental and hostile aggression. Instrumental aggression is aggressive acts that serve as a means to a particular goal. The intent is to harm. Injury is impersonal and limits opponent's effectiveness, such as body checking. And, in hostile aggression or reactive aggression, then the goal is to cause injury. Okay? The intent is to make the victim suffer, such as a sucker punch. The factors influencing aggressive perception, it is against norms in sport-specific cultures. So depending on what the norms are, they're going to affect how the behavior is exhibited. The viewpoint involved in behavior as aggressor or victim, and the outcome of an act. Did injury occur? So bullying and hazing in sport. Really, really important aspect to take a look at. Bullying is the imbalance of power between peers, where the one who is more powerful repeatedly attacks the less powerful with the intent to harm. Okay, bullying is usually based again on the power differentiating between peers or teammates. While the form of bullying described in the textbook was, is primarily verbal, it can be physical, using physical actions to gain power and control. It can be social emotional, such as excluding others or spreading rumors. It can be sexual, when we start getting into vulgar gestures, uninvited touching, crude comments, prejudicial, based on race, religion, or sexual orientation. Or electronic, using the internet or technology to threaten, post images, send hurtful emails and texts. We're seeing an increase in that in most areas of sports and just in adolescent behavior now as social media becomes more prevalent. We are definitely seeing a lot more of bullying happening online. And lastly, bullying behaviors tend to increase when team norms do not prohibit this behavior. So hazing is another behavior among team members that is strongly influenced by team norms. Members engage in dangerous activities with the beliefs that participation in such acts will strengthen team bonds. And, or for rookies, will show their